In the spring of 2020, the entire world was making sense of a little-known virus. Things were spinning out of control. And in New York, comedian Eitan Levine's grandma was dying of COVID.
My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. It was funny. When I was younger, we weren't that close. And then towards the end of her life, we were very, very close.
But now, Eitan couldn't even leave his house to say goodbye, which really got in his family's way of observing certain traditions around death and dying.
You're supposed to read this prayer to people as they, as you say goodbye to them. We said goodbye to her like over a phone call. They put us on hold in the middle of the phone call. And for several minutes, I was crying, listening to the hospital's on hold music, just for that boo-bop, shoo-bop, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. Just listening to smooth jazz. And then every once in a while, the operator's voice would come on, just be like, coronavirus is a very serious issue.
But when it came to the funeral, things got even harder. Eitan's family usually has traditions to help. But now they had to piece together tradition with their own resourcefulness in a moment of crisis. For one thing, Eitan and his family couldn't sit Shiva. I should explain Shiva, a Jewish ritual of mourning. People come over, bring food, tell stories of the person who died.
My family has a tradition where you don't leave the cemetery until the casket is covered. That's the tradition, right? Because of COVID and social distancing and just the chaoticness of the funeral, we couldn't get them to bring the machine over to cover the casket. And at this point in the pandemic, there's only 13 people there. Everyone is an old Jewish woman or man, except for my sisters. And I literally had to bury my grandmother. I was the only one that physically could do this. So with a shovel and a pile of dirt, I fully buried my grandmother, fully, just me.
Despite these crazy circumstances, and thanks to Eitan, the family followed its tradition. Eitan also got a little creative with tradition. He implemented something I'd never heard of before.
Yeah, Shiva logic.
Shiva, that Jewish ritual of gathering together. Eitan kind of came up with his own COVID spin on it and called it Shiva logic, which basically means he came up with a set of rules to follow in this time of grief.
Yeah, I didn't smoke weed before 11 a.m. every day of Shiva, like a hero. Right. Literally out of respect for my grandmother, which is the funniest thing. I was in the city, just kind of mourning in my own way. You know what the thing is?
Yeah.
That is a really good example of how everyone parses Judaism and religious baggage in their own way. And there are certain things that just stick with you. And the idea of being respectful during mourning via not smoking weed made a lot of sense at the time.
You still adhered to the tradition as best as you could. And I'm wondering, why? Is it because you had to? Is it because it's comforting? Is it because you can't imagine life otherwise?
Here's the thing. At the beginning of the pandemic, I also wasn't exactly rah-rah for God. This was a crazy situation. Was I doing all the Jewish stuff because I wanted to? Yes, not maybe. I don't know if the tradition was being kept up there because of my own personal, want to do that, or just because, my parents were there and this was a Jewish funeral and you do what the Jews do when someone dies.
Eitan and his family had a structure I don't have. He knew what to do, what the Jews do when someone dies. For me, the point of Eitan's story is that his family had these invisible tent poles. The whole world could be utter chaos, but those traditions held them in place. For me, the point of Eitan's story is that his family had these invisible tent poles. The world could be utter chaos, but those traditions held them in place. I want badly to understand them, because at some point in my life, I will be grieving a loss. And I think I'll want those traditions there to ground me. Just like I want prayer and Shabbat, those earlier topics I learned about, to ground me. So I started asking around and found some answers that didn't just surprise me, they moved me. Because we're not just talking about tradition. we're talking about how to deal with the time we have left. This is Shofar So Good, a podcast about my search for Jewish answers. I'm Kate Mishkin, and this is Chapter 3. No day but today. I recently read that people say Judaism is at its best in times of loss and mourning. I didn't exactly understand what that meant. How could a religion shine in moments of loss? When I met Rabbi Panitz, who I spoke to about God in the last episode, I asked him about that. And he told me that our traditions help us make sense of a painful experience.
I think the reason people feel, and I feel, that Judaism is at its best in times of loss and mourning is because Judaism is a religion of practice. It's a religion of action. And so in a moment of loss, with all of the big and unanswerable theological questions, how could God let this happen? Where is my loved one going? It's not that Judaism doesn't have attempts to answer those questions with a whole lot of humility, but it's that the questions don't live at the center of the Jewish relationship to loss and mourning. Practice does.
The Jewish framework has all these prescriptions on how to navigate grief, starting with the moment someone's sick, leading up to the burial, then through the next 7 days, and even into the first year. In theory, these rituals are designed to offer stable ground when the world is spinning.
The first thing that these rituals communicate to both the bereaved and the community around the bereaved is that death is part of life.
There's a built-in acceptance that death is unavoidable, and that we don't need to avert our eyes, and that it's painful and has a ripple effect. But part of embracing life means embracing loss, not limiting yourself because it feels wrong or uncomfortable to grieve.
Classically speaking, there are two principles. So one of those principles is called Kvod HaMet, honoring the deceased. And the other principle is called Nichum Avelim, comforting the mourners.
All the rituals surrounding death tether back to these two ideas, honoring the deceased and comforting the mourners. An example is reciting the mourner's Kaddish for a year after the death of a loved one. It's supposed to be said in a group of 10 Jewish adults, a minyan. It's normally recited during Shiva.
Shiva is the Hebrew word for the number 7, and it refers to the practice of mourners remaining in their home for the 7 days following the burial of a loved one, and receiving visitors who show up in order to take care of the mourners.
The mourners aren't supposed to go anywhere. They don't work, they don't shave or cut their hair. In fact, tradition says that mirrors in a Shiva home should be covered with black cloths. And the community's responsibility is to take care of the mourners, feed them, clean up, and be there for them as they grieve.
And we live in a society which asks people to pretend all the time that they're doing just fine when they might not be, and to suck it up and get back to work and put on a happy face. And Shiva is the Jewish tradition's way of saying you don't need to do that. Stay where you are, both physically and emotionally, and we'll listen.
This is a beautiful tradition. This emphasis on community, in some ways, is exactly what I'm looking for in my life. But I imagine myself in this situation, and I don't think I'd want to do it. I'd feel like I was an imposition. I just can't imagine myself opening up in that way to other people and making myself so vulnerable, not just by asking for help, but grieving openly. And that thought alone makes me shut down. I love this tradition, but I love it for other people. But then I imagine how I'd feel if someone asked me to sit Shiva with them. I'd consider it an immense honor. Being part of a community, I suppose, isn't just asking for help, it's about providing it too. And I especially like what Rabbi Panitz told me happens at the Shiva.
The most important moment of a Shiva minyan, of a Shiva gathering, is where the mourners are invited to share any memories or reflections or stories that they have about their loved one. The community listens to those stories and then carries those stories with them once they leave the Shiva house.
As a journalist, this is super resonant. As a young reporter, I wrote obituaries, and I tried to lead with stories that embodied a person's life, rather than basic details about where and when they died. By sharing stories of the deceased, you're bringing part of them with you. They live on in those tales.
Because what it offers to the mourner is this plethora of perspectives on who their loved one was, and sometimes introduces them to aspects of their loved one's life that they might not have known, right? To hear from the coworker of a deceased relative what they were like in the office, or a college roommate, what they were like before you might have even known them. It fills out the picture of the life that the deceased lived in a way that hurts, but grief and love are intertwined. It expands our heart in both grief and love, which is ultimately the project of Shiva.
The pain is part of the love you had for this person. The whole person, who in this process is remembered as if through a kaleidoscope, through different angles, from different people at different points of their lives. It's almost like the fullest expression of the deceased. Early in my career, when I wrote those obituaries for people who died, I tried to interview their kids. I tried to understand what this person did for fun, where they volunteered, how they spent their days. I tried to make my own kaleidoscope. I guess I was doing something Jewish when I didn't even mean to. We'll be right back. Hey, it's Kate. I want to thank you for listening to the show. This project is grant funded, and I've really leaned hard on my community to help make this. We're still looking for help to continue the show and finish out the season. If you want to support our work, consider making a donation by visiting shofarsogoodpodcast.com/support. That's shofarsogoodpodcast.com/support. And thanks. Okay, back to the show. In thinking about mourning the dead, I also started thinking about what it means to be alive, and how we act when we know our time is finite. I wanted to talk to someone who works with people on both sides, helping those on the verge of death and the folks left behind. Someone like Rabbi Lynn Liberman.
I sometimes say I'm just generally not the person you want to have to see in the middle of the night, but I'm happy to always be there. I'm just really honored to show up and be present to people, because they need to be connected to, and they need that support.
Rabbi Lynn was ordained in the conservative movement and is a board-certified chaplain. Chaplains can belong to any sort of religious denomination, and they offer spiritual and religious guidance outside of a traditional religious setting, like a church or a temple. Rabbi Lynn is based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and she works with both Jews and non-Jews.
People who are unaffiliated, marginalized, forgotten about, sort of hidden away.
That includes folks who are incarcerated or doing addiction recovery. She also spends time with fire and police departments and in hospice and hospitals, and she loves her work.
I learn from every patient that I get to meet, and especially those at the end of life. They teach me about life. And I think that's God's hand.
I met folks like Rabbi Lynn at the beginning of my career as a breaking news reporter. But at that point, I didn't really have a sense of the magnitude of the work. I worked for a newspaper in coastal Virginia. Every night, I listened to the police scanner, praying for a night without shootings, fire, or car crashes. But inevitably, news would break, and I'd have to get in the car and go report on it. This was agonizing for me. These were the worst nights of someone's life, and I had to stand there and ask them questions. I always felt like I was intruding, like I shouldn't be there. But I started noticing these other people who were also there at breaking news scenes. They were noticeable because they weren't in uniform. They weren't police or firefighters. They were chaplains. They talked to victims and family members with ease, and vice versa. People seemed to appreciate having them around. I normally filed my story and went home. I tried to do justice to the story and the survivors, but I knew I wasn't equipped with those tools. But I remember looking with wonder at the chaplains who showed up and stayed. They felt like angels. They were just there, not to take up more space, but to provide a special space for people who needed someone to listen.
It is a distinct privilege to be let into people's hearts in really vulnerable times. It's sacred. I think those of us who take our work seriously and are trained as board-certified chaplains are very keenly aware of that very special, delicate space that we stand in. It's God's space.
Rabbi Lynn's work is no doubt informed by her faith. But she makes a point not to make any assumptions about other people's faith.
If you've met one Jew, you've met one Jew. So my next question is, who are you?
Rabbi Lynn tries to find ways to talk about God that are tailored to the person she's speaking with, no matter who they are. She's finding inspiration wherever it comes. Like from Mr. Rogers, who famously said, "Look for the helpers." Or from Star Trek.
I sometimes use the image. I ask people, are you a Trekkie? Or do you know Star Trek? And they'll look at me kind of like, well, sort of. Well, I say, so on the uniform of all Starfleet people, they have this little symbol here. It's actually called a universal translator. Those are God's ears. Say it any way you need. And if it's words, great. If you want to sing a song, that's amazing. If you want to sit in silence, God will hear your heart. If you want to draw a picture, you can draw a picture too.
Anyway, I came to Rabbi Lynn because I want to understand how people think about faith and God in near-death moments. How a person's relationship to a higher power changes when they're nearing the end.
What's on their mind? What's in their heart? Do they have any worries? Sometimes the questions are closure. I'll say, is there anything that is really sitting on your heart? I haven't talked to my daughter in 15 years. I really want to hear her voice one more time.
These are the regrets that people have as they enter the waning days of their lives. They're not thinking about how much money they made or what kind of house they bought. They're focused on the relationships they cultivated and those they let slip. It makes me think of the commandments that are meant to give us a guide on how to lead a good life.
We're not living to die. We're living to live. It's what is the difference can I make in this world? That's what our mitzvot are about.
Our commandments require us to make some sort of positive change in the world every day. And one way to do that is by attending to your relationships.
That's what every earnest day gets stacked up at the beginning, which is by the time I get to the end of the day, what has changed? And have I had anything to do with that?
That seems doable to me. I can do good in the world by being a nicer sister, a more attentive friend. As I've been working on this project, I'm starting to see the way that these things string together. I don't know if I'm making any sense of Judaism or if I'm just kind of making sense of my own life. But think about it. Shabbat is for slowing down and prioritizing relationships. Part of slowing down might be talking to God. Faith in God, at least according to those I talk to, is a lot about connecting with other people, with their own hopes and joys and pain. It's all starting to make sense as a way of being in the world. This all feels relatively easy to understand. But after we die, that's where things get a lot more complicated. I just want to take your temperature on heaven. What happens?
Not as hot as hell.
Joking aside, in Judaism, there's no eternity in hell to motivate us to be better people. Our ethics tell us we should be good people for the sake of being good people. But I'm still wrapping my head around that. My underlying question behind that would be, in the absence of a heaven or in that we don't know or whatever the answer is, what does it tell us about the way that we live our lives?
It's such a great question. And it's a source of a lot of confusion amongst Jews. What do Jews believe about the afterlife? Do Jews believe in heaven? Yes, we believe in heaven, but no, we don't believe in hell. I've heard all sorts of sort of combinations of theories. But maybe that's the word to start with, theory. I think really the starting place in the Jewish conversation about the afterlife is we don't know. We don't know, which I find that humility to be quite beautiful, honest.
No one's ever come back with a report on what happens next. So in the absence of that, Rabbi Panitz says there's all kinds of theories, but there's no fire, no brimstone, no torture for eternity. The whole point is to live for the now, not for whatever comes after. We live for the people we love because we don't know how long we have together on this earth.
Can I tell you a sort of personal story that has really impacted how I think about this?
Of course.
My friend Eric, who was a childhood friend of mine who passed away 2 years ago, in his 30s, went out for a bike ride in New York City, was hit by a truck and was killed.
Oh man, I'm sorry.
Thank you. And it was an enormous loss for his wife, for his family, big personal loss for me as well. He was really a dear friend of mine. 11 days after he died, I had a dream, and there he was in the dream. We were in a park with this big swinging gate, and he showed up looking a little bit younger than how he looked when I last saw him. And he said to me, "So I heard you were at my funeral. How was it?" And I sort of I was there. It was really hard. In the next part of the dream, it was almost like end scene. And then in the next part of the dream, the two of us are walking together. I asked him, "What are you learning these days?" And he said, "Bava Metzia." Okay, Bava Metzia is a tractate of the Talmud that I would not have expected him to say. It felt like an invitation to learn with him. And the chapter that we learned together deals with the laws of lost and found, which such a painful and present frame for the grief that I was navigating. Here was this friend of mine who felt totally lost.
This, Rabbi Panitz said, expanded his understanding of loss.
There are some aspects of death which are really final. I'll never get to hug Eric again. He never got to meet his daughter, who was born 6 weeks later. And there are actually so many pieces of him that are not lost, that remain available to be found. I can find Eric in caring about what he cared about. I can feel Eric by imagining and by tapping into that emotional space where he loved me. And I can feel how he felt about me. And in all of those ways, I feel like I can connect with him and I can continue a relationship with him. I understand that as the continued existence of his soul in this world, and strive to be in ongoing relationship and connection with his soul. It's really hard because it's an entirely new language. But I've come to believe that we really can find our loved ones amongst us, the souls, the memories, the visions, the dreams of our loved ones amongst us, even after they've died. And in that way, their death isn't final.
Our relationships matter the most while we're here. Life is, in some ways, a test of how we treat other people. And by extension of that, at least the way I see it, our relationships continue with the dead, like what Rabbi Panitz said. The people we care about live on in stories, in Shiva, and in ourselves. We relate to their soul, and through that we relate to them. Which takes me to the next episode, atonement, and why we have to ask for forgiveness every single year.
So the idea of it's the thought that counts, not in Judaism.
Shofar So Good is written and produced by me, Kate Mishkin. Edited by Lacy Roberts. Music composed and performed by my mom, Nan Schwartz. Our production assistant is Jack McDonald. Artwork is by my sister, Laura Mishkin. Engineering and sound design by Jesse Perlstein. The song you're listening to is called Swirls and Eddies. It was written and performed by Grace Corsi as part of her debut album, Downriver. This project was made with support from the Jewish Writers Initiative Digital Storytellers Lab, a project of the Maimonides Fund. Many, many thanks to Janine Oakman, Sarah Lefton, and Rebecca Friedman. Thanks to Alexandra Zahav, Alex Salzberg, Natasha Ruck, Frida Wiesel, and Matt McKinney for lending their ears and wisdom to this episode. There's absolutely no way this podcast would exist if not for the support of Reka Murthy and Ian Koss, or my parents, Nan Schwartz and Rob Mishkin, and many thanks to my siblings, Laura, Natalie, and Andrew Mishkin. If you like what you're hearing, please tell a friend and leave a review for this podcast. And we'll be back next week.